Chad, let's get into the deep dive. It's from James. Do you want me to read this one this week? Although you did a fantastic job of reading the last week about
I had little punctuations I wanted to make. So this one, no, it's all you, man.
All me. Cool. James says, so many of your episodes talk about the importance of strength training, and I fully agree. As a 55-year-old guy, I know that I need to up the time I spend doing moderate resistance training. So I'm pretty sure that strength training will add more to my overall quality of life when I'm 80 than riding will. That's a great 100%. Assumption for him to make. 100%. Right?
Yeah, he makes a lot of good points, actually. I don't want to spoil it, though. Go.
Cool. Says, I realize that for the elite level riders whose lives revolve around riding, this isn't an issue, but my life doesn't revolve around riding. This is resonating with a lot of us here, right? I just really want to beat my mates to the top of the climb and go fast. I think that my cycling lifestyle may be similar to many of your listeners. According to previous podcasts, if I do TrainerRoad workouts too close to strength training, then my mitochondria cells reverse their bioneutron genome. Insert Chad speak here. I think he's just throwing in words.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about the bioneutron genome today.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, science. He says, I don't have the time or desire to work out twice a day. After a TrainerRoad workout, I'm too exhausted to do any type of strength training. If I do the strength training first, I can't complete the workout. I need my 2 rest days, I think. So now I'm down to 2 days on the trainer and 3 days of strength training, which seems like my ride training will suffer. I've also thought about lowering my FTP quite a bit so that I can do both workouts back to back. There has got to be an answer to doing these close together and making moderate gains in both. You may have covered this exact question in a previous podcast, but I've listened to most of them several times and I still haven't come up with the black and white answer to this question. This is a great point because he's talking about, well, actually, I'm not even going to say it because I know you're going to say it and I would butcher it and I would sound like the science words, buzzwords, things that he just inserted. So Chad, take it away. Where do you want to start with this?
Yeah, so James, this is a really big topic. It kind of revolves around concurrent training, which we're going to talk about. And your question specifically is something I want to address in more detail than I could with the other things I want to cover that are going to set up a better answer to your primary question, which is how to kind of make strength training and endurance training play nice. So next podcast, and I won't be here next week, but I'll be here the following week, is going to be, we'll cover how you add strength training to an endurance training regimen and basically fatigue management when you do it, because that's really what we're talking about here. So the objective today, going to kind of lay the groundwork for that. And I'm going to explain why I believe that we're not at the mercy of what's called the interference effect. Okay. So interference effects basically states that opposing stimuli, and then in our case, that's combining endurance training with strength training, something termed concurrent training. These stimuli negatively impact many of the sought after adaptations that endurance training and strength training can bring us. So if you think of exercise on a spectrum, we have endurance at one end and we have strength and hypertrophy at the other, hypertrophy being bigger muscle fibers. So put it another way, we kind of have substrate metabolism, or how we metabolize fat and carbohydrate on one end, and on the other, central nervous system adaptation and muscle synthesis. Okay. So endurance training improves our ability to metabolize or break down fuel to create energy, whereas strength training actually improves our ability to generate force via the buildup of muscle tissue. So endurance training is a catabolic process. Strength training, especially on the hypertrophy side, is an anabolic process. And then when you think of strength training on the neural side, I still view it as anabolic, because you look no further than the physiologic phenomenon of neuroplasticity, where we actually form and reorganize neural connections. I mean, that's a form of building, right? It's definitely not breaking down. So when we train for opposite physiological goals, so we're simultaneously trying to improve catabolic and anabolic processes, we're trying to simultaneously improve endurance and strength. This leads to adaptive interference, AKA the interference effect. So to put it really simply, endurance adaptations are harmed by strength training and vice versa. But never mind the vice versa. We're going to focus on the fact that we're worried about strength training negatively influencing our endurance adaptations. So the gist of this is that we can balance the conflicting training stimuli and not dilute the adaptive response we're specifically looking for. And concurrent training proponents believe that both forms of training are beneficial and that a balance can be struck, that we can increase our fatigue resistance and we can increase our muscle size and force producing capabilities and push the pedals harder, right? The assumption is that neither the endurance adaptation nor the strength training will ever be optimal. But the more I read, the more I learn. I believe that's an arguable assumption because the research around both concurrent training and the interference effect often falls short, and it does so in a number of ways. And that's the gist of what I want to cover here. I have about 5 different subtopics, some super succinct, some are might feel a little bit bloated, but all of them are what I feel are fair criticisms of why we can't lean in too heavily into this whole interference effect idea, not to the point where it tells us what we can and cannot do in terms of combining strength training and endurance training. So
Can I put this in really simple terms really quick? That strength training, because of the processes that go on in your body when you strength train, that makes it so that you cannot get as effective of adaptations from your bike training and vice versa. That's the concept, that doing one will hurt the other, right?
Yeah. They're effectively conflicting messages. So we send one message, we want one specific set of adaptations, but then we send an almost opposite message and want adaptations associated with that opposite message. And there's interference between the 2 sets of messages and their interpretations, and hence the adaptations that we want to come with them.
Awesome. Cool.
Okay. So criticism number 1 has to do with mechanism. And talked about this a number of times, and that it's a long road from what we see at the cellular and the molecular level to what's our end game, performance improvement. So we can see improved performance even in the face of this interference effect. I mean, that's the gist of my whole argument today. So an example is a study that looked at recreationally active women. Another study looked at professional soccer players. Another study looked at male and female military recruits. And in all cases, they used a combination of sprint intensity training, so high intensity interval training, and they combined it with strength training, which is in this case, heavy strength training. So low volume, high intensity. And in all examples, they enhanced their overall performance in their relative fields. So in all 3 of these cases, pretty wide diversity in types of players, what they need to perform better. They all saw improvement. So the takeaway is that an understanding underlying mechanism doesn't promise results. So it doesn't matter how well we can see into the details, how well we can look at the cells and the molecules and say, okay, the AMPK and mTOR-C1 do this to PGC1 alpha. This is metabolic or catabolic. This is anabolic. Doesn't matter how well we understand that. How that translates to performance still isn't super clear cut. So I'm not saying we can write off and forget mechanism, but I am saying that just because we understand mechanism doesn't necessarily mean we understand the performance outcome.
Yeah, well said, Chad. Because that's that's a common pitfall that we fall into with everything with scientific research. I've fallen into it
so many times.
Yeah, because the mechanisms seem really clear, right? But like you said, there's so much filtering that gets in between you and then pushing your pedals faster.
Well, and I think that, I mean, this is the impetus behind why I wanted to revisit the interference effect, because the first time we explained this, I was completely deep into the mechanism. I was looking at the alphabet soup of all these things and all their interactions and what they mean for mitochondrial biogenesis and what they mean for strength adaptation, that I lost sight of the fact that, yeah, this makes sense way down at the mechanistic level, but again, does it translate to performance?
Yep.
Okay, so another criticism of a lot of the research surrounding concurrent training and the interference effect is training status. A lot of studies fail to consider the differences in their subjects' training levels. And there's a lot of evidence of this. The evidence that the introduction of endurance training into a strength training program, and I realize that's backwards from what we're talking about, but this is an example of how compromised lower body strength happens in trained, but not moderately trained or untrained individuals. So in the case of the trained individuals, it was actually less pronounced when they separated the sessions. And we always talk about how much we have to separate the sessions, and we talk doing it the next day, do it at the end of the day. But in this case, they only separated by a couple of hours, and they saw a decrease in the interference effect for highly trained or at least trained strength athletes. So that already tips us off to the fact that maybe there's not too much to worry about. Pardon me. All right. Another study looked at high intensity interval training on the bike right after heavy strength training. And this was looking at the effects of muscle strength and hypertrophy. Sorry, it's ridiculous. Okay, so in this study in particular, they over the course of 8 weeks, took untrained college males, had them work out a couple times a week, and they both saw similar increases in strength and hypertrophy. So they could move more weight and they had bigger muscle fibers. Yes, their rate of force development or their SNAP did decrease in the combination group, but on the other side of things, the capillary density and the aerobic capacity increased in the combination group. So the takeaway is that strength plus immediate high intensity interval training after led to significant increases in some of the areas that are relevant to endurance athletes. And it didn't inhibit the strength gains in the untrained young men. So again, training status is something that actually has to be looked at. And I think a lot of us maybe don't qualify as untrained, but probably most of us fall into the moderately trained group. Now, when it comes to concurrent training and untrained females specifically, a study looked at concurrent training with different aerobic exercises and different intensities. And this was a decent sample size. They had 44 young women, physically active, but they hadn't done any structured training at least 3 months prior to this study. They separated into 4 groups where they did strength training. All they did the same strength training, but then some of them did run workouts, some of them did bike workouts, some of them were intervals, some of them were continuous. So they really varied it quite a lot. Had them do it a couple times a week for 11 weeks. And the concurrent training yielded similar neuromuscular adaptations. So that neural adaptation that leads to strength benefits over the strength alone group. And on top of it, they got increased endurance capacity. Now, more support that the higher training status can actually lead to greater interference effect was a very recent systematic review and meta-analysis that looked at strength development during concurrent training. And once again, untrained, moderately trained, trained individuals. And this, I think 27 studies actually met the inclusion criteria, 750 participants, and they confirmed that as athletes become more trained, concurrent training actually leads to smaller strength gains than just strength training. So strength gains are likely to be harder earned as our endurance and fitness ascends. And this is kind of a known thing, but what's not so known is that even in experienced strength athletes, there was no significant impact on strength gains if the sessions were separated by, in this case, just 3 hours. So no interference effect with just a little 3-hour gap in between workouts. And this actually carried the same session, concurrent training too. So athletes who did their endurance training and went directly to strength training 10, 15 minutes later, or vice versa, no evidence of the interference effect. So takeaway 1 is if you're untrained, forget the term interference effect. Doesn't apply to you. It's not something you need to concern yourselves with. Probably the same with moderately trained athletes, again, which is where a lot of us fall. Second takeaway is that when targeting strength gains, consider prioritizing your strength work. And we've talked about that a number of times. What's more important to you? Well, place emphasis on that.
So this is interesting because if you're a strength athlete, and let's say you're really going for lifting heavy things and that's your goal, and you just want to supplement it on the bike, it seems like there's a greater chance at having possible interruption there, like with having your strength training be affected by adding more endurance training, possibly. But when you go the other way, when you're talking about athletes that are prioritizing endurance training, the strength training doesn't seem to come at the cost of it.
Yeah, and I honestly wish it were that simple. It's not quite that simple, but that does hold up for the most part. And most people don't need to dig any more deeply than that.
Leave it to me to oversimplify.
No. It's appreciated. Okay, so another criticism with the research surrounding these two things is training variables. And basically we're talking about the interplay of training volume, the load, or the intensity, depending if it's on the bike and in the gym, exercise selection. And that's something we're going to dive in more deeply on the next podcast, et cetera. So a study that I found really enlightening was by Fife, Bishop, and Steptoe back in 2014. And I liked it especially because along with the words, all the hard words, they diagrammed the interference effect concept. And if you link to it, if you want to look at it, it's figure 2. And they showed that endurance training has effects on the strength training response. So if the intensity and or the volume of your endurance training is too high, it results in what you'd expect is residual fatigue. But that can lead to a decrease in force production, which is tied hand in hand with a decrease in type 2 fiber activation. That can lead to a compromised strength training stimulus and a reduced anabolic response to strength training. Okay, same thing goes with substrate depletion. So you do an endurance workout prior to your strength training and you go in with depleted glycogen stores. That can lead to increased amino acid oxidation. So now you're burning muscle and now you're burning protein. This is the fear we've talked about a number of times that many people worry about, probably too much so, but it's still a topic. And that leads to that same reduction in the anabolic response to strength training. So this same diagram by Fife and colleagues also addressed the proximity of exercise sessions and noted that if endurance training precedes strength training, both that residual fatigue and that substrate depletion are in play during your strength training. And then if one session is in too close proximity, meaning you didn't gap it enough in order to relative to that other session, the endurance training session, same thing happens. Okay, along these lines, another very recent study looked at the impact of low volume concurrent training on muscle adaptation. And this is especially interesting. They looked at 290 military conscripts, totally randomized assignment. I mean, there was just no rhyme or reason to it. You got plunked into one of these two groups and you worked out for 9 weeks, and you either did 4 by 15-minute strength sessions or plus 4 by 15-minute endurance sessions, or you simply did a 1 by 60 of each. And they were separated by at least 2 hours. And in no cases did you work out more than 3 sessions per day. So at the most, I guess, 60 minutes per day. They looked at a whole lot of measures of strength and endurance and physiologic adaptation. And what they found was it didn't really matter which protocol was followed. So I think this poses the question that if shorter and longer workouts yield similar results in so many ways, why do we care at all? And my answer is because fatigue, its effects on consistency, its effects on subsequent workout quality, its effects on the quality of the workout you're in, especially when it comes to strength training. The idea of if you have 4 sets and you train to failure on that first set, how does that impact sets 2, 3, and 4? And that's something I'm going to elaborate on the next time we talk about this. So the point is that one of the points I'm trying to make is that these variables are all aspects of the interference effect that are well within our control. So recognize it or not, all the stuff that happens at the mechanistic levels, we still have ways to influence how much this interference effect actually impacts our eventual outcome, our performance. Okay, next criticism of some, not all, of the literature on these topics is the order of exercise sessions. And this is a tough one. This is the one where I think we get a heck of a lot of questions. If I do my strength training first, if I follow it after VO2 max work, oh man, so many permutations. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to lean on one of my favorite researchers, Keith Barr, and his paper using molecular biology to maximize concurrent training and a few specific recommendations, because these seem to bear out across the literature. High intensity interval training, perform it first, give it a 3-hour gap. The idea being for the endurance signaling to return to baseline before you do your strength training, the signaling for which can last at least 18 hours post. In that gap, fully refuel during that interim stretch. And this is backed up by a couple of studies, probably cited in his paper, where metabolic signaling responses to endurance training inhibit protein synthesis. So this is an anti-anabolic. So it doesn't have to be catabolic. It's just not promoting the anabolic side of things that could be taking place. But these are relatively transient, don't last as long compared with the anabolic signaling that follows strength training. So to put that simply, endurance training signaling fades quickly, strength training signaling fades slowly.
So would that imply that it may be better to do your endurance training first and strength training later if you were to fit it into a day? Is that what that's getting at there? Yep. Basically, I mean, there's no real optimal because there are other factors. If we could have things exactly the way we wanted, if our days were wide open and we could structure our workouts based on no other commitments or obligations, yep, probably. Interesting.
But even then, probably not definitely.
Yeah.
Okay. Another of his recommendations is strength training later in the day, followed by protein ingestion. And this just makes sense. He got specific and said leucine rich protein ingestion. And then he said again prior to bed. So this does assume that we're trying to build muscle mass. But I mean, if you're engaging in strength training, whether you want to or not, a little bit of muscle mass is going to creep into the picture. Doesn't mean you're going to bulk up. Doesn't mean you're going to kill your strength to weight ratio, but bigger muscles can do more work, can create more force. Another recommendation of his was that performing strength training after low intensity training actually accentuates the endurance adaptation. So when I say low intensity training, basically talking about endurance work. So riding around 60-65% threshold. And it actually accentuates this endurance adaptation more than just doing that low intensity training alone. And the low intensity training won't actually impact the strength training signaling. So an aerobic endurance ride followed by strength training actually yields can yield, has shown evidence of better endurance adaptations.
This is like, I know there's no room for anecdote here, but I'm going to throw one in just the same, because they're dealing with studies with like much larger scale. But I don't know if you've noticed this, Ivy, but when I am keeping up on my strength training and I'm being very diligent with it, in addition to that, I feel like I am faster on the bike. That doesn't mean that I can press harder on the pedals. That doesn't mean, and my assumption is always this, is that the strength training in some way is actually helping magnify or helping increase those adaptations that I'm getting from the endurance training. Have you noticed that too, though? Like where they go hand in hand and you have like a compound effect?
Yeah. And I feel like I'm not sure how to describe it. I guess it's hard to quantify, right? But feeling like you have a strong trunk and a strong core and that you're more comprehensively solid makes the effort on the bike feel less leg heavy. It's hard to describe, but I agree with you. And especially with off-road disciplines too. Yeah, definitely want to refute this. I don't know if James was implying that, you know, people that are just revolving around riding, they don't do as much weight training, or that it's not a problem for them. But like even all the elite cyclocross athletes that I've traveled with this year, everyone's doing stuff off the bike between races every weekday. It's totally part of our routine.
No, Ivy, I took issue with that sentiment as well. I think James just doesn't understand that even at the elite level, strength training, and then I don't really like the term resistance training, simply because even pedaling the bike is a form of resistance training. So I'd like to lean more towards strength training, but strength training comes in a lot of different forms, and it can be entirely body weight. It can be entirely isometric, and they carry benefits. And pro level, high level, world level athletes still do some form of it. And some of them do quite a lot of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. All right, Chad, sorry for my anecdotal interruption here.
Nope. Jump in. It's
cool.
Quite a lot of info. Okay. So the least interference consensus seems to be that separating your endurance training from your strength training by at least a day, so 24 hours between training simulations, is optimal. But researchers commonly recognize time constraints. It's just the way it is. So want to tell you not to worry. And one of the reasons why I say that is because of just more evidence. A 2017 systematic review and meta-analysis on concurrent strength and endurance training sequence. So this was a review of literature up through 2016, noted that endurance training before strength training versus the other way around. And then they use lower body 1 RM strength and VO2 max. So they were measuring strength with, how much you could, I think, squat 1 time max, and your actual VO2 max. And the inclusion criteria for this review was greater than 8 weeks of training. They used males and females, teens and seniors, trained and untrained, and they separated the training modes by 5 to 10 minutes. So we're basically talking same session workouts. And they found that 1 RM, or so your max strength, was higher when strength training came first, but there was no change in VO2 max regardless of the session order. So the takeaway being is that training order for endurance athletes who are concerned with VO2 max may not really matter.
Interesting. Because that hits at one of like the main questions, right? Is that where do I stack them in my day?
Yep.
Huh.
Honestly, I think most of this is just, we think too much about it because unfortunately, we understand mechanism and it messes with us.
Yeah.
Okay. So another
overthinking things. That's a shock.
Yeah, exactly. It's a cerebral sport.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. So another criticism is how fatigue is treated. So endurance training, sadly, is often just overlaid with the addition of strength training. That's how it is. It's not, I'm going to add strength training to it, so I'm going to cut back on my endurance training in such and such ways. Rather, it's just, I'm going to pile this on top, see how things go. So we kind of covered residual fatigue up top, but what about fatigue due to this increase in training load? So a paper by Coffey and John Hawley, it was a review 2016 asking, do these opposites attract? And I want to quote them. It's possible that acute residual fatigue from a previous exercise session and or chronic fatigue due to undertaking a greater total workload to match adaptive responses of single mode training are generating the interference effect. So simply, we're outpacing our adaptive resources. It's too much stress. It's too much fatigue. We can't accommodate it.
Yeah. It's common. And we hear athletes all the time say, I added strength training And now that I've added strength training, it's hard to, I don't feel like I'm improving quite as much at the same rate. That's typical what we hear for the first week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something like that. Because like you said, Chad, they're keeping everything the same, and they may have been operating it, even if they had more time, they could have added on more stress to what they were doing before. The fact is they have now added on more stress, but we like to compartmentalize it and keep everything in such a vacuum where we're like, no, this is my bike stress, so it should be fine. And I should not feel any different than all of the other forms of stress that I'm bringing into my life, which this one in terms of strength training is quite literal and very direct and comparable to what we're doing in that regard.
Well, as endurance athletes, I mean, we're juggling a lot of balls. So we're trying to do quite a lot of training. And if you're a multi-sport athlete, quite a lot of different forms of training. And then we just layer the strength training on top, and it's understandable. You want to include this too, but in some cases, maybe you can accommodate that additional stress. But I think in too many cases, it's just that little bit, that straw that breaks the camel's back, that you have to figure out somewhere else that you're going to tone things down such that you can accommodate this. And that would be my advice on this matter for any athlete I were coaching, is to tone it back, cut out one workout, add your 2 30-minute strength training sessions, and then you can bring that workout back later if you see evidence of the fact that you're accommodating this new increase in a different type of stress too. So not only is it more stress, but it's a type of stress your body's probably not at all accustomed to.
I'm laughing because even just core is like the easiest thing to want to cut out when I'm really tired. Instead of laying down on the floor, flopping around. It's, of the proprietary.
I'm not sure the quality is core training, but I get your
it's
your
totally true. Yeah. Of the things to cut
around.
out between training and work and preparing food for myself and sleeping, it's the easiest thing to want to.
But that's a super good point. Even core training, you think I'm just going to do a little bit of core training at the end of the day because core training's easy. Well, it's not. It's really not if you want it to be effective, especially. So it is yet another form of stress that you're piling on top of it. And if you're dead tired, even just rolling over on the floor to do a plank for a minute at a time, that's more work. That's the body that could be convalescing, that is now asked to do a total body muscle contraction.
There have been multiple times where I've laid down with the intent of doing core work or something else, whether I have the foam roller or something else. I just find myself flipping the foam roller in my hands. I'm just like, I'm not doing this right now. Yeah. I'm sure we've all done that. Hopefully that's relatable for more than just me right now. So yeah. What's next,
and then probably my favorite topic of late is nutrition and how it impacts all these things that shamefully, I have to admit, I didn't look as hard at as I should have in years past. So nutrition is typically poorly addressed and often overlooked entirely in so many of these studies. So my question is, could the interference effect be less about competing signals and more about insufficient nutrition? I do think it's a question worth asking, even if there's nothing there. So if really this is a matter of endurance versus strength, which is really a matter of catabolic versus anabolic, which is really a matter of substrate metabolism versus protein synthesis, then it's kind of a matter of carbohydrate and fat versus protein intake, if we want to look at it from a nutritional perspective. So if we go back to that 5 paper, the one with the diagram, they talk about substrate depletion. So carbohydrate and fat depletion leads to a decrease in the anabolic response. And this translates to both an increase in protein breakdown and a decrease in protein synthesis. But what if you nourish properly? This may be the question. It's a question that doesn't get asked often enough. Too many of the concurrent training interference effects studies neglect to address nutrition. And one example is a study that looked at concurrent exercise and muscle protein synthesis. And yes, for space crews, I get it, but I'll allow it. And here's why. Strength training following, in this case, 90 minutes of strenuous aerobic cycling led to suppressed protein synthesis. There was no mention of additional nutrition in this post this 90 minute pre-ride, which was also followed with 30 minutes of rest. So basically, by all indications, these athletes went 2 hours without any sugar. Only mentions of nutrition in this entire study were first the Ensure Plus dinner that they had the night before, which was 50% of their daily caloric intake in the form of those god-awful little meal replacement shakes. Secondly, they conceded. This is a
For
bummer of a
study
meal.
subjects. Yeah.
So they did concede that the poor nutritional status of astronauts in orbit may contribute to the ineffectiveness of the exercise countermeasures. Probably. Okay, so how about fasted training? It's a pretty buzzy topic, but fasted training we have to recognize has very specific targeted outcomes. But even still, whenever you read about fasted training, it's usually accompanied with warnings talking about don't overdo it, ideally employed in moderation, only in appropriate scenarios with respect to duration and intensity. So the point is, even when insufficient nutrition is the intention, nutritional intake is still of keen importance. Also, nutrition is yet another variable within our control. So I ask, why wouldn't all studies around concurrent training interference effect closely track nutrition? And there's a lot to be gained there, but do it for no other reason than to rule this out as an influence on their findings.
I think I know why, Chad. It's hard. Like when if you're dealing with so many study subjects, like some of these, with like 290 with those military conscripts and things like that.
Yeah, that's understandable.
Getting everybody to eat. I mean, even when you're dealing with a few people, to get them to eat the same thing. And then also, who's to say that those people will react similarly to the same exact dietary restriction, right? It's so complex.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's a
Yeah.
very solid point, but
Yeah.
it doesn't remove the fact, or it doesn't obviate the fact that this is still something hugely important to consider in just about
Agreed.
any study surrounding exercise. We have to know how the participants were nourished.
Agreed. It's kind of like a drawback of the clinical study model, right? And it's just complicated to do that. And the answer to usually weeding out and getting rid of a lot of those variables is to have more study subjects. So then you can average things out, but then it just gets even more complex to control that. So, but like you said, even though it's very difficult, that still doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done, because what we put into our bodies is absolutely what we get out in terms of performance. So to ignore that is, it's problematic.
It should at least be included in the study design, whether or not they're super happy with how well they did it and how honest their participants were and how well they followed the dietary recommendations. It should at least be part of it. And maybe it probably is. If I paid attention to old studies versus newer studies, I'm sure it's better represented these days than then. Okay, so on a related note, and these are two interesting points that kind of conflict with one another, but caloric restriction induces anabolic resistance to strength training. So basically, if you're starving yourself, don't expect big strength or hypertrophy gains. Okay, that in and of itself, that's obvious. If we're not furnishing enough protein, we're doing a bunch of strength training and our muscles don't get bigger. That shouldn't be surprising to anybody. But then Camera and colleagues in 2012 demonstrated that low glycogen doesn't necessarily suppress anabolic response to strength training. So kind of the other side of things. And there's a reason I brought this up, and I'll get to it. They looked at 16 physically fit males. They had, so their histories where they trained at least 3 times a week, concurrent training for more than a year. They all had VO2 maxes roughly in the 50 ballpark. So they weren't deconditioned. They weren't highly conditioned, somewhere in between. Moderately trained, as I refer to it. They did one leg where they depleted it of glycogen. They did 10 minutes, couple minute breaks at 75% of their 2-leg VO2 max. So that's tough. I mean, they calculated VO2 max with 2 legs, and then they had one leg do that work, or 75% of that work, until basically they cooked it. They depleted it of glycogen, and then had both legs do 8 times 5 unilateral leg press. So one leg presses at about 80% of 1 RM. So this is pretty hard work, and it's quite a lot of work. So the takeaway is that in the event that you perform muscle endurance work, so say you do threshold repeats, over-unders, sweet spot work, and you can eat before your strength training, the anabolic signaling may not suffer as much as you think as a result of, let's say, occasional glycogen storage. I'm not saying this is something you should do on a routine basis, but if it happens, don't sweat it. You may still actually get something out of your strength training. And this provides us with an example of high metabolic endurance training followed by high volume strength training, and how the two can still play nice, at least in the short term.
Yeah, and the key to differentiate, Chad's talking about the fact that if you don't have all that glycogen on supply, full, bottles filled, so to speak, in that regard, with strength training, it will not be as harmed as much. However, endurance training is a different deal.
Exactly. So if at the end of the day, you've done your endurance training earlier, you ran yourself down, you realize, man, I haven't replaced all that glycogen. This is going to be a terrible strength training workout. I'm probably not even it isn't even worthwhile. I'm not going to get the anabolic signaling that I'm after. Well, this study says maybe not.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay. And then a study a few years back by Wong and colleagues demonstrated that the addition of strength training can actually enhance mitochondrial biogenesis, which is something we chase with endurance training, but this is being yielded by the strength training side of things. So they had athletes or participants do an hour. It's about 65% of VO2 max. So we're talking about in the ballpark of 80% of your FTP. They rested for 15 minutes, and then they did 6 sets of leg press at about 70 to 80% of their 1 rep max. So reasonably high intensity, as many as possible, or 15, whichever came first. But either way, fair amount of work. And contrary to their expectations, the strength training following the endurance training amplified this mitochondrial biogenic signaling compared to the endurance training alone. So they actually got better endurance adaptation, or at least, more mitochondrial proliferation or signaling to it than if they just did their endurance training. So the takeaway being is that 1 hour of moderate intensity cycling, closely followed by pretty strenuous lower body strength training, actually increased endurance adaptation, providing us with an example of moderate intensity cycling on the bike, and then with the addition of high volume lower body strength work, and it didn't negatively impact endurance goals.
I mean, Ivy and I could have saved them a whole lot of time and just told them that, but that's
we're just psyched to hear it backed by science, so we can
that's right.
Go do mad deadlifts for days and feel good about it.
That's it. That's awesome.
Okay, so finally, I want to look at the landmark study that actually inspired this entire avenue of research. So we got to go back to 1980, where Hickson, Robert Hickson, basically looked at the interference of strength development by simultaneously training for strength and endurance. It's the title of the study. It's linked. And some subsequent criticisms. And these aren't even mine, but I agree with all of them. And I've punctuated it with little bits of my own editorialization. So first, Hickson's moderately trained athletes would not meet today's standards for moderately trained. And I quote, several of the subjects were active in recreational sports, but none had been training on a regular basis for at least 3 months prior to the start of the exercise program. That to me says untrained. Maybe not completely deconditioned, never trained, but that's untrained. That's the 3-month gap. Mm-hmm. Then let's look at the protocols themselves. And this is fascinating, and for a number of reasons that we'll talk about. First, the endurance protocol, 6 days a week for 10 weeks. They had to do 6x5 VO2 max intervals on 3 of those days. On the other 3 days, 40 minutes of running as fast as they can. So basically high-end VO2 max work on the bike or low-end VO2 max work on the run. But they were just flogging themselves 6 days a week for 10 weeks in a row. On the strength side, only 5 days a week for the same 10 weeks, and it was all about legs. 5x5 of squats, 3x5 of knee flexion and extension, 3x5 of leg press, 3x20 calf raises. And these were divvied up on different days, but 5 days of this. And it was all done with as much weight as possible, which suggests to me training to failure, which again, we're going to talk about next week. So, and then the third protocol, which was endurance plus strength. And it was just these together, just combine them, just do it all.
So the subjects died?
Yeah, exactly. So the combination one is just more work, plain and simple. They didn't volume match it. Okay. They didn't tone anything down to make it the same volume across groups. These poor SOBs just had to do all of it. So these are all
Science
massive.
Is sad.
In this case, it is. Back in the 80s, it was. So these are all massive doses of training for any athlete, let alone untrained athletes. So another criticism, not mine, is that the endurance group saw on the order of 2.5 times the amount of endurance training that has been used in subsequent similar studies. So no one has taken things to this extreme since. And it sounds like I'm ripping on Hickson here, but we all have the benefit of hindsight. He was a frontiersman. This is his first time laying it out there. Here's my theory. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to beat him up real bad and see how these two things intertwine. So can't fault him at all. Can fault the athletes who stuck it out for 10 weeks, though. I hope they were paid well. Okay. So lastly, fatigue, nutrition, sleep, hydration, recovery, none of those things were described, which just leaves us to wonder. So again, my takeaway is not a critique of this landmark first time study, but rather a criticism of anyone who leans into this study without considering or knowing the details. Okay. So put another way, if this is your basis for argument, it's perhaps not the strongest support for the interference effect. Okay. And in closing, I'm just going to read you my 3 overall takeaways. First, The interference effect simply doesn't have enough unequivocal support to deter any athlete from combining strength training and endurance training. Be clear on that. Secondly, at least in my opinion, unless you're at the elite level, there's almost certainly more to be gained from concurrent training, strength training plus endurance training than endurance training alone, regardless of workout order, intensity, duration, proximity to other workouts, combination of workouts, etc. Don't get hung up on the details. Do them both. They're both beneficial. And then thirdly, adaptation has to be nourished. Even in fasted training, which may inspire signaling that can lead to adaptations, the downstream adaptations themselves have to be nourished.
Those are really good takeaways for athletes to be able to apply, and like, these are things that I should do with strength training and keep in mind moving forward.
Now, I hope to get a little more specific, and so not next week, but the week after. I'm still trying to put it all together, because this is literally half of the research I came up with on this topic, which is why I got divided into two podcasts. So I got to trim that down such that we can have some very actionable takeaways, so that people aren't still left wondering, well, what does that mean? What do I do next time I go to the gym? So give me a couple of weeks and we'll see what I can put together.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you, Chad. It's great insight into that. And I'm glad to know that Ivy and I are scientific.
If you like this video, make sure you give us a thumbs up.
If you didn't like this video, you can give it a thumbs down, but let us know what you would have done differently in the comments below.
If you want to see more of these videos, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you want to become a faster cyclist, check out TrainerRoad.com.
Do it.